let in folks. Hey, how's it going, Mark? Good to see you.
Hello there, how are you?
Very good. Very good.
Good.
Got a lot of snow here in Chicago, but
Oh, have you?
yeah.
Oh, we've
Yeah,
got rid of
everybody's got snow right now. It seems like the whole country has it now.
Not us.
Really?
It's
No.
88
Or
degrees.
it never gets snow.
It's 88 degrees in South Florida.
Has it ever snowed in Florida? I feel like
Yes,
some
I
cold
do
places
remember
it
it
will
once,
hail.
Right. Yeah, we do get hail. I remember the one time it snowed in Miami because I was a kid in school at the time waiting for the bus to go to school, and it came down. So I saw it with my own eyes. It didn't stick, obviously, but it really
Right.
was snow. But that is the only time. I don't know if it was in recorded history, but certainly in my lifetime. I'm 57, so this was in the 70s when it happened.
Whoa. Okay.
It was
Yeah.
quite an event.
Yeah. All right. We'll dive in. We started a little bit late here. I'll just give a little description for us to the people watching on Facebook, YouTube, and then we'll dive in a little bit. This is a business podcast Mastermind, started with a few talented friends in the business and podcasting space who expanded it to create a weekly event where a wider audience could join. Your co-hosts include Rob Green-Lee, VP of Content and Partnerships at Libsyn, chair of the Podcast Academy, co-host of the New Media Show, and longtime evangelist of the podcasting industry. Another co-host, Henry Lopez, a serial entrepreneur, small business coach, and host of the top-rated How a Business podcast, dedicated to helping others start, run, and grow their small businesses. We also occasionally have Vinay Koshi. He's the host of the Predictable B2B podcast, founder of Sproutworth. He helps others achieve predictable business growth and influence through content marketing. And I'm Ethan Janney, business and executive coach and co-host of the Run With It podcast, which invites 7+ figure entrepreneurs to share business ideas and the action steps to launch them. So last week, we had an interesting kind of a crossover guest. We brought in a fellow named Nikki Skeen, who has coached TEDx speakers. And I think he said over 2,000, which is pretty incredible. He gave us some insights into telling our story, but particularly with the perspective of who is our audience and how are we talking to our audience. And he gave that perspective based on a couple of factors that he's used to using. So one is for TED Talks, of course. Another is just for when he meets people and he's interacting with them, how to talk to them. And then we applied that to podcasting to try to kind of consider, of the 4 types, which I'll go over real quickly, that he mentioned, what kind of audience members do we have that fit into those 4 categories? And I thought it was actually quite interesting because, the way he defined it, you do see these kind of categories do kind of exist. I don't know if there's more categories, but you see these categories of folks and how they want to be talked to and communicated with. And it seemed like each of our podcasts probably touched upon not just one, maybe 2, maybe one of the primary types and maybe a secondary type. And then if it delved into the other types, that was kind of maybe a place where we could trim things away. So he had an interesting heuristic for the way he remembered it. He used his marketing experience to give an analogy. And he gave the analogy of 4 different types of marketing, like an ad, right? So he said there's the headline, there's the body copy, there's the illustration or image, and there's the logo. And basically, just to summarize, the headline type of person, when you're talking to them, he might think of that as kind of the top level executive type of person. They really want you to get right to the point of what you're talking to. They don't want you to go into deep detail. They want the Cliff's Notes version, and they want you to keep coming with lots and lots of new information all the time. But it has to be these sort of Cliff Notes, this, Cliff Notes, that, Cliff Notes, this, Cliff Notes, that. Give it all to me. I get it. I'll figure it out. The body copy type of person is the nerd. They want all the details. They want to go intricately into all of the fine details, and they could geek out on things, and you really can't go too deep. That's kind of what they want to do, is go deep. The image or illustration type of person, he communicated as kind of that laid back person who, if you start talking to them with dense information too quickly or even too much, they get turned off. They want to talk about your weekend. They want to get to know you. They got to get comfortable with you. They want to have a little fun, and they really won't pay attention unless they feel that interpersonal connection. And then finally, there's the logo type of person. And I think this is the one he explained. They'll probably talk more than you do. And they really don't want to listen that much. But when they do listen to what you're saying, it's got to grab their attention. So it's got to be flashy. It's got to be a sound bite. And it's got to be something kind of cool and fresh that they can easily share and pass along, you know, in a tweetable thing or a quotable thing, whatever. So I thought that was quite interesting. I see that those types of individuals exist. In the case of an article, I think you know, like he was explaining, you do have all of those things because you don't know what kind of audience you have. But I think we talked about, in the case of our podcasts, we might focus on one or two types. I'm curious. So we went last session, we each maybe went through and defined who our kind of audience was. I'm curious, Mark, as we talk about these different types, are there any one or two that you feel like your show appeals to most?
Probably the nerd, because I spend an hour with someone and I really go into detail with them. The interpersonal one, the image illustration, I don't think I really, I do pleasantries, but I don't. I'm looking for detail. I'm looking for content, and sort of, rather than having a nice chat about what we did at the weekend. I think there's sometimes there might be the headliner, the sort of not details that that people could just grab sort of headlines, and that's what I try and do with my video content on social media, is grab a minute or two for those type of people. So it's probably between the nerd and the headliner, I would guess.
The body copy and the headline.
Sorry, body copy.
Is it body copy? Yeah.
Body copy in the headline. Yeah. Yeah, and actually, he didn't give us those sort of titles until after he talked about the types, and he probably did. He did convey it as like the nerd before he even said that was the body copy type.
No, it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, our show, as it's tough for me to think about. Oh my gosh, what is going on? My headphones keep cutting out. Let me switch my audio real quick. Okay, can somebody say something?
Yeah, I'm still here. Can
Okay,
you hear me?
cool. Let me turn up my volume. Yeah, for our show, I'm trying to figure out, you know, which of the types we have. I definitely don't think we're the flashy logo type. But I do think we get into the three categories. There's sort of like the executive headliner, there's the nerd kind of level, and there's the weekender kind of level. Weekender is kind of who we refer to as the illustration image type.
Yeah.
I think we're primarily the headline and secondarily the weekender, which is kind of interesting that those, I don't know that those two things feel like they go together. Or so the headliner and the image illustration. And we have two hosts, so it kind of seems like even though Chris and I both have an appeal for those types, he kind of plays the role of, let's get the facts out, let's make it quick and punchy and dense content. And I kind of play the role here. I'll make a joke here and there and bring in the personality and make sure we're kind of having those connections. So I'll continue to think about it though, but it's very clear, as I mentioned it to Chris now, since we had this session with Nikki last week, that as we're working with Cortland from Indie Hackers, we've joined this Indie Hackers network. He has definitely pushed our show more towards the headliner, the executive approach. And he's bringing this insights per minute thing, and don't go. He tells us, like, I don't think you should go too deep into things. You want to just give enough of a taste that people get interested, and then they can go research it, but don't go too deep.
How long is your podcast, Ethan?
It usually doesn't end up being longer than an hour, so it's probably like half hour to 45 minutes, depending on how it gets edited. Yeah,
because I think that's probably a sort of defining factor on where you sort of fit, is how much detail you go into. Is it a 20-minute podcast where you're just literally hitting headlines, or do you go into more detail or want to talk about more detail? I think plays a factor. But as you say, what were you saying, like your content is, you need to keep on delivering substance to your content?
Yeah, well, at least that's kind of what we're getting pulled from with Cortland. So he'll say, like, I don't know. For example, he's encouraged us to kind of share little success stories, right? And there's just, we're even coming up with a format that works really well. And you might say, this person, how about this person that runs this company that's making X amount a month or a year or whatever. And then that's like catches the attention that you want to listen to their story. And then you say something quick like, they started XYZ company back in 2017, with just a spreadsheet and 10 people. And then they slowly, gathered users, and, now they got to a point where they're at this point. And like, that's it. We don't now go on to a tangent talking about that business or going into it in detail, or talking about how it functions in a deep way. It's time for the next thing. And we've kind of also been encouraged to even cut in, because we end up having 3 people on the show too. Just now I'll just cut in and I'll change the subject. Like, we'll be on a topic and I'll be like, oh, hey, one thing I wanted to bring in was, and I'll just bring in something totally different. And again, the feedback has been, the listener doesn't care. They actually they're not so worried about the connection between the topics as much as that they want some new information.
But what about the connection with your guest? It can be a little bit off-putting for them if you're talking about A and then you cut across and talk about Z.
I think it actually, we've also gotten the feedback before we were working with Cortland that it's okay to cut the guests off. And I feel like, in a sense, there's a couple reasons why it works. One is because the format of our show is kind of like people sitting around a table chatting, and they're not necessarily the center of attention. We tell them up front, we say, hey, we're just going to have a conversation. If you have something interesting to say, you say it. We're not going to ask you, we don't ask questions. We've actually tried not to ask our guests questions. We try to just say stuff. And then just basically tell them that's what's going to happen. We're going to say stuff. He's going to say stuff. You're going to just come in when you feel like you have an interesting thing to say and just say stuff. You can raise your hand. We had to do a video thing. Raise your hand if you feel like you need to cut in. And so that happens all the time, right? Like, who hasn't sat down at a table of people, they're talking about one thing and you want to get a word in edgewise, and all of a sudden the topic changes to a totally different subject. And you're like, oh, I can't even share that thing anymore, And I think that my sense is the guest actually appreciates that we're guiding the conversation, because a guest can ramble on for quite a while. We've noticed in the very beginning of our podcast, our first question is, what made you think of this idea? Or, what made you think of this idea? Because they share a business idea. And, they can go on, all of a sudden it's like 15 minutes later and they're starting to explain all of the minute details about it. And we're kind of like trying to cut in. And I think in the end, they might feel a little bit weird if we cut them off, but they appreciate. I think the reason they're just going into all these details is they don't know what they're supposed to say. So they're just going to say everything. I don't know. That's my thought. And I don't know whether our listenership is increasing a lot. So I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's that we've changed our format. I don't know if it's just that we have this exposure from the Indie Hackers Network, or just a combination of a bunch of things. I think we're improving on multiple domains, but we're kind of trusting that approach. We've gotten feedback from multiple people, including our producer, that's good. Just like cut in, change the topic, don't go too deep.
Yeah, I was
And
looking in these
Yeah.
4 categories and trying to think, can a particular show encapsulate all 4 of these? Can you as a show producer produce a show that satisfies all 4 of these people? And the more I thought about it, there are some groupings, I think, that are associated with each other more so than others of the 4, right? So as you think about a show that you produce, I think that the headliner and the logo personalities are probably more compatible. And the body copy and the illustration one are probably the other set that are compatible with each other. But once you start throwing too many of them together, I think you kind of, it makes it difficult to produce a show that caters to those. So I don't know what you guys, have you guys thought about that?
Yeah, I think the only way that I could wrap my head around trying to, because when we actually asked Nikki this direct question, like, oh, how should we approach this? And he's like, well, the narrower you go, the better. But the truth is, there are those 4 categories that he came up with in a advertisement, because you want to communicate with all these different types. So the only way that I could think about it is having different segments of your show, or realizing that different parts of your show are for different people, and just trying to make it compartmentalized enough that they don't step on each other's toes. Actually, I was writing, I have a team that writes emails for a project, and I've got an email from one of our customers actually yesterday. He said, your emails are too wordy. I don't, it's too much words, right? And I was like, okay. So I emailed him back and I said, well, what would you prefer? And he said, like 50% less words. I gave him options: 50%, 75%, 25%. I like 50%. And then we sent out another email today, and he actually wrote me back. And he's like, here's how I would rewrite it. Nice guy. And so we were like, well, sometimes our longer emails are cool because they contain like content, information. It's otherwise you're just getting an ad or something. So we were talking about ways to organize it. So we could say, here's the email, and then up front it says, here's the sort of TLDR. Are you guys familiar with this term? Too long, didn't read.
Yeah.
It's kind of a techie kind of way of saying, give me just the minimum information. So we could put a little section right at the top of every email that says, here's what's in this email. We'll talk about this, this, and this. And then, and here's the link for what the link is that you need. And that's it. And it takes like 2 or 3 lines. And then we could like very, noticeably say, and now here's the deep dive, right? And that way, somebody who doesn't want to go deep can still enjoy our emails. That's a way.
I thought it was interesting because I listened to a lot of it earlier today, the last interview. I thought it was interesting, Henry, what you were saying, that you see on your numbers, your analytics, that some people only listen for the first half an hour. And I thought it was interesting. I've not seen that in my results, but I would imagine that's probably the case as well. And just while you were talking, Ethan, I was thinking, well, perhaps the first half hour could be a lot more shorter and punchier, and sort of headlines move things along. And then at that sort of 30-minute mark, find topics, discussion points, and the second half an hour is a little bit more in depth. I don't know how staged that would feel as an interview, but
I know it's something I've struggled with,
it may not be
because
the
numbers are contradictory.
One thing,
too.
right?
I mean, I do have that stat, but then I have people who tell me, I love how at the end you summarize with the one thing you want me to take away. So, and it's because what this helped me realize is there's different types of listeners, right? I mean, not that I didn't know that, but I think there's different types of listeners. I will say, though, that, Mark, from other people that I've talked to, so both anecdotally and based on the data that I have, that half hour seems to be about the sweet spot. So then what I had been doing over the last year is, all right, well, because I had been going, I think a little too long, maybe closer to an hour. And I've been working on reducing that. But at some point I said, but I still have to do my show. I still have to do what I want to do at the end of the day. So I've kind of not stressed too much about going past a half hour, even though there is that drop off at the half hour point.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, because I could see what you guys are saying is that the headliner listener is looking for get to the point, cliff notes, short, and that could be at the beginning of the show, right?
Correct.
And you cover key points at the beginning, and then but what's interesting is that the feedback that Ethan got was the guy wanted to rewrite your email, right? Which was which fits into that logo category too. This is the guy that likes to talk and is flashy, right? He's pushing his way into, taking a prominent role in what you're doing. So you can kind of see that playing out in real time there. That person is not somebody that's into fine details necessarily, though he's probably getting a little detailed, nitpicky on you to some degree. But
and I think the other thing, I'm sorry to interrupt, Rob. The thing we have to realize that very, very different delivery of information, that written versus what we're doing in a podcast.
Right.
And I think these 4 types, they of course relate to written copy. And so if you're writing from a newspaper's perspective, I mean, that's what newspapers still do, right? For the stuff that they want to attract your attention, there's a picture or a graphic or some sort of infographic component. The beginning of it tells you the gist of it, and then you want more, you got to go to page 54. So all of those techniques apply there that are a little harder for us to apply, I think, with our format as a podcaster. Yeah.
Well, that's that logo part. That's the flashy part, is that image, right? That people get pulled to visually, and that's what our episode art is supposed to do, or our cover art.
I can see that, but
Or if you have a blog post, that visual imaging can be a part of that experience too. But yeah, so I mean, I can see how this maps to maybe a format, and if I think back to the old radio show that I used to do, it followed this pretty closely, and I didn't do it consciously. I tended to put up at the beginning of the show a lot of like teasers and kind of like bullet point kind of stuff, teasing about what's in the content, right? And playing like 30 seconds of an interview or something like that had a deep value point. And I can see that catering to the needs of that headliner that's looking for just the key takeaways, and then he can move on with his day if that's what he wants to do. So or her, I suppose. It's probably not a gender thing. So anyway.
But for me, coming from some of you as well, coming from a sales background, my instinct is always, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, right?
Right.
So that tends to fit into some of this as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
there's a new resource, relatively new, at least to me, resource, and I'll try to remember the name of it, but I've also been referred to it by Cortland of Indie Hackers. Maybe you guys will know what after I explain it. It's kind of like a new way of digesting the news. So it's a site where they really actually try to put a lot of bullet points in it, and not stick to the typical format, and so that somebody can read over it quickly, as we kind of want to do these days,
to scan through.
Yeah. A couple things that I've been thinking as we're talking about this. One, you could have, like, for example, the headline person and the body copy person. This, if you appeal to both of those and you don't want to alienate one or the other, you could have this type of format where you do these really short episodes. Like this one, I think it's called Indie Bites. It's also in this Indie Hackers Network. They actually do very short episodes. But if you want to listen to the whole episode, then you're a subscriber, right?
Yeah,
so the short episodes can keep the people coming and attract people, and they just want that, and they don't even want the nerd out stuff. So it's totally fine, and they're happy. And then if you are a nerd and you want to get the details, then fine. Then you have your own place where you can consume the content, and you don't have to do too much to edit the content. You have to spend so much extra time creating 2 types of content. It's just a matter of editing your existing content.
So I
Well,
think
and
that's
formatting
why.
your show to deliver that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
I'm
was
sorry,
just going to
Mark.
say, that's why I do solo stuff as well as interviews,
Mm.
and so I sort of attract that sort of headliner that is literally a business idea, a business concept, something I've experienced, and it's a very solo 2 to 5 minute
Mm.
podcast. And some of them are spur of the moment stuff. Sometimes they're planned. It just depends on where I am. But then I will then do the interview as well. I've reduced to two, one solo and one interview a week for timings. But I think that's why I quite like doing the solo stuff as well, because it just, I suppose from a personal point of view, it just triggers my brain doing something different, which is quite interesting for me. And so I can spend 5 minutes just talking about a concept, an idea, or something that's happened in the news or whatever it is, as well as the in-depth interview, which I sometimes spend 45 minutes. Sometimes I'll spend like an hour and a half with one person. If the flow of the conversation's good and the content is good, and I think I'm getting something out of it, I think my audience get out of it, it can go over an hour in some cases, depending on the guests and their sort of timelines as well.
Have you ever thought of, with those longer ones, I've given some thought, Mark, to maybe breaking it up into 2 parts?
Just thought of that too.
That's something
Yeah.
I've thought about doing, because it would appeal to me to go with some conversations, like you said. I don't want to cut this off. Now, of course, I would have had to have scheduled that time with the guest, right? So there's
Yeah.
that component of it. But I've toyed with that idea. But I love the what you're talking about. Is I've tried to strike that balance. There are times, though, to be quite honest, when I have a little bit of imposter syndrome, and I think like, well, nobody wants to hear me talk about a topic. I know that's not the case, and those end up being just as popular episodes. But I also try to make those shorter episodes, not as short as you're doing, and I got to give that some thought, because that would allow me to not be as overwhelmed with the production of it if I'm trying to do 2 longer. A solo topic episode and an interview is a lot to produce for me in 1 week. Yeah.
I think that's what I've experienced. 3 episodes on why my current workload with other things is too much. So I'm just hitting one on Monday, which is the interview, and then a Thursday episode.
Yeah. I like that. I like that idea, because that way you don't have the deadline of having to have 2 out the door Monday morning.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I just think that's why I sort of mix it up for the people. And to be honest, my numbers, when looking at the analytics, some hit resonate with people, and I get a spike on the solo stuff. Sometimes some interviews spike, and it was interesting something you were saying, Rob, last on that interview, and you were saying that for you, the actual host is the attraction to the listener, and it didn't blow my mind, but I was just like, well, I've always thought that it's the guest which is the trigger for the listeners. It's not me that people regularly come back to. But when you think about it, they're coming to see you every week. They're not coming to see that guest every week.
Yeah, that's how you build regular audience, is you focus on you, the host, and the guest just adds to the conversation and isn't a replacement for. And I think that keeps people coming back week over week over week, where if you focus too much on the guest, then people are coming in and then they're not coming back next week.
Yeah, it took me a while to wrap my head around that, Mark, certainly in the first couple of years. But there's no doubt in my mind now that the reason the people who come and listen regularly are listening because they want my perspective on whatever it is that we're talking about. Hence why it's so important to understand that we are not journalists in the traditional sense where we're supposed to be unbiased. Our listeners want our opinions on whatever the discussion topic is. They want us to challenge the person that we're interviewing when appropriate. We've talked about that before. And as Rob say, I agree completely that, the data has shown me, and the conversations with my audience have proved to me that the reason they're coming back, as Rob says, is because they like my perspective on how I uncover things. And so we have to, and the reason that was so important to understand for me, as Rob has talked about, is you have to understand in that while you're making the guest shine, you have to put yourself there as well, right? We're not just journalists asking unbiased questions and letting the guest shine. It's both. It's a delicate balance, I think, is what we're trying to strike when we interview someone.
Yeah.
It reminds me of late shows. You've got like Conan,
Good
and
point. Yep.
you've got Colbert, and they've all got the same guests actually,
Right,
pretty much.
exactly.
But I have fun watching Conan, and I might not watch Jimmy
That's a
Kimmel
great
as
point.
much because I just love the Conan atmosphere.
Right. You like the questions he's going to ask, or his sense of humor, or
Right.
his
Right.
warped view of something. Then
Right.
that's probably why you tune in night after night.
Yeah, there is a formula there that those guys go under.
Yeah,
Those guests come in with a with a role that they play,
That's right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
and that role is to be a character,
Yeah.
to interact with Conan, and to obviously plug whatever TV show or movie that they're doing. But it's to tell stories and to interact with the host, and Conan's up there to do almost like a stand-up routine is what that's
Right.
his role, and that's the role that all those guys play. David Letterman, all those guys, they're comedians, right? So
Yeah.
that's the role that they play in any conversations they do on their show.
Now, on the other hand, I certainly believe completely that the reason for my audience numbers now are because of the network effect of guests. So that has been critical. I really don't believe that I would have anywhere near the numbers if I did not have all of the guests that I've had that share the show with their audiences.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely it's about synergies. I think that's one of the themes for me of podcasting in general. It's the sum of parts that it's greater than the whole
Good
is
point.
greater than the sum of the parts. And so all these things come together and people like it. And there's certain things that are more important for certain roles, but you kind of need them all.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of observations, sort of on off topic. So just because I'm thinking of them, I actually recently watched, they do these compilations now on YouTube. I saw a bunch of interviews with Jeff Goldblum and Conan O'Brien.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hilarious. It was really fun to watch. And Jeff Goldblum did this thing where he takes off his glass. He always wears like a cool, interesting pair of glasses, and he would take them off and he would toss them onto Conan's desk, just as like a hat. It was just something he would do in the middle of talking, and he'd take them off and he'd toss them onto Conan's desk, and you wouldn't really notice it. But Conan, we're like, what are you doing? Why are you throwing your glasses on my desk? And he'd pick them up and he'd put them on. And then actually, as you see all these different episodes where he's been on Conan, you see it now. It's actually something that Conan does when Jeff Goldblum comes on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I started to think, oh, this is like a running joke that they have. And that's
Right.
why he keeps throwing them on the table. And maybe that's not even a habit that he has, but he does it on the Conan show.
Right.
Very interesting. I watched a similar thing, Jeff Goldblum on Craig Kilborn.
Right. Craig Kilborn.
And no, not Craig Kilborn, Craig Ferguson. Sorry, Craig
Yeah.
The British
Talk
guy.
about a crazy guy. Wow.
And what I found, I didn't find it as entertaining, first of all. And that's just me. I'm more of a Conan person. But he threw his glasses on Craig Kilborn's desk. And Craig Kilborn didn't do anything about it. I mean, sorry, Craig Ferguson. I keep mixing them up.
He didn't volley back with him, right?
He didn't use
speak up
that.
on
And I think that illustrates kind of exactly what we're talking about. That it's the guest, yes, but it's the host that you enjoy. And it's the way the host picks up on the things that the guest brings to the table, and some people are going to pick up on some things and some people aren't. And that's what those are those really bad podcasts where you have you have a great guest and the host is totally bombing, just asking them, what's their favorite
or there's
color.
just not a it doesn't click, that goes to, I spend a bit of time, as I've shared before, trying to get a quick feel. Do I want to talk to Ethan? But even sometimes when I think, oh, this will be a great conversation, it could end up being not so great, or the reverse. So there's sometimes where I go into thinking, I don't know if I really like this guy. And then we end up having a great conversation. So it's hard to predict without spending an inordinate amount of time ahead of time on it, right?
Right, true.
But yeah.
Did you have something to add, Mark? I saw you kind of
No,
gesturing.
I was thinking while you were saying that, Hemi, and it's interesting when I look back at the guests that I've had on that I've enjoyed and I think has had a really good rapport. It doesn't necessarily reflect with numbers, and I don't know if that's
Interesting.
and I need to have a little look at the sort of a year's worth of numbers,
Right,
and
yeah.
see where the ones that, let's just say, I enjoyed and there was rapport and we went over the hour slot versus the ones, because I've had a couple of people that it's their first or second podcast and they've completely bombed and they've been awful.
What have you done in those situations? Do you release it anyway?
I release it. Generally, I tend to release it unless it's really, really painfully bad, I will release it. But yeah, it's like a couple of guys I've had on 2 or 3 times, and I need to look at the numbers of those people that I've had 2 or 3 times on my podcast, because I think while we're talking tonight, I'm sort of thinking it'd be interesting if me enjoying it, does that translate to the audience enjoying it?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think sometimes though I would submit, Mark, that you gotta not look at so much of the numbers. At the end of the day, the reason you're still going to be doing this 4 years from now, to the big extent in my experience, is because you do enjoy these conversations. Otherwise, it's going to become a chore, and then it'll be no good for anybody, right? So I think that regardless of the numbers, that has to be one of your measures, even if you can't tie it necessarily to the download numbers. That's my thought.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone, I don't think anyone does it here, but I've been a guest on some people's podcasts, and I think I've said this a couple of times. When you're on there for 20 minutes and they ask the same 3 questions to every guest, I would have to shoot myself if I was forced to do that type of podcast.
I've been on some bad ones because I've taken the philosophy of I'll be on anybody's show that invites me, I think within reason, but I don't know that I've ever turned anybody down. But yeah, I've been in those situations as well. And so I just grin and bear it and feel like, okay, listen, who knows? Maybe one person listens and says, hey, I like what that guy has to say. And it's funny, the most recent one I was on, I wasn't hoping for the best because I had listened to that person's show previous, and I didn't get a good vibe. But then it ended up being a great interview, and she did a great job with it. So I was just pleasantly surprised. But yes, I've been there for what you're talking.
Definitely been on podcasts where, and I've only been in a handful, but during the interview, as I perceive their skill level at the whole podcasting thing, I actually get to a moment where I ask myself, they have the skill level to actually start a podcast and find people to invite and get them on the show. Because during the interview, it doesn't seem like they have that, or maybe those are just separate skill sets or something like that. But yeah, there's just been times where I'm actually wondering how they pulled it together enough to put.
Listen, it goes to the low barrier to entry. And I'll tell you, I don't know if you guys are experiencing the same, but I certainly this year so far, I am receiving, I'd say 3 to 5 inbound inquiries per day.
Wow.
Of people wanting to be on the show. So there's a lot of people that want to get on podcasts, right?
Yeah, I would say that as well.
Mark, I wanted to ask you, what is your typical reason for having the same guest on 2 or 3 times? Just curious.
Totally personal reason. I like them. I get on with them. There's a strong rapport with them. So I've had Deb on twice. We got on really well. There's a guy, Stephen Kuhn, I've had on twice. And the first episode, it was relatively structured in the sort of career and where people got to their success and how they did that. The second one was totally, and I now do most of my second interviews more sort of on the laid back interpersonal, the illustration, because we've got the rapport. I have prepared something where there's usually a heading like coaching or biz, or do you know what I mean? There's a heading, but we end up just literally chatting. And a lot of the episodes where I've done 2 and 3 episodes with the same person, the second and third one ends up just being a natural flow conversation. And yeah, that's why I have them back on. There's definitely a few people recently in the last sort of, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, which I would definitely look to have back on. Yeah, it's a very personal thing. It's like I always ask one question, very, very personal to something that I'm interested with every guest. Like there is a very personal question. If there's a, I don't know, making it up, a sales and marketing guy, which is very standard, but if I have someone like that, I will ask them, well, this is what I do in my business for my marketing. What do you, is it a good approach? Is it the right way to go? And I will do that on every interview that I do. There will be something that's very personal to me with their sort of expertise lays.
One format that I played with for many years with my radio show that isn't really played with too much, and you're starting to tap into the thinking behind it, is that you, as a show host, you develop a show concept, right? And then you have like 2 or 3 people out there that are like almost like correspondents to the show that come back and are like guest co-hosts on a regular basis. And so what you're doing is you're actually training your audience to look forward to those people coming back to the show.
Yeah, I think you're right. I didn't realize it, but I think you're right, because I think when you're listening to a podcast, you get a feel whether there's a rapport with the guest and the host, and it's a lot more enjoyable if there's a joke, if there's a interesting story, if the host says something that's provocative or interesting, or the guest says something that's new or different. I think I definitely feel it when I'm interviewing people and talking to people, when there is that connection, and that's why I get people back on, because it's enjoyable and I'd like talking to them.
Yeah, it just depends on whether or not that person has the depth to really almost be, comparable to you, right? But maybe come at the particular topic or subject area of your show that brings a little bit more depth to whatever.
I think it brings depth to
offshoot,
the
right?
well, because it's like I was just saying about Stephen Kuhn. We talked very formulaic in the first one. The second one, we started talking about his ayahuasca trips to South America, and it was all very, very personal things about his experiences, and he had he's a great guest. He was in the army in Germany. He then was a bouncer for a while. He then worked in the music industry with helping promote some quite big guests. I think it was Andrew Bocelli and things. And now he's sort of evolved into a business sort of mindset, and he does different types of businesses and scaling businesses and stuff. And he's like a really good example of that person that you get on with. Yes, you'll plan the second episode, but it's just it's more like your thought, Ian. You're literally sitting in the pub or sitting at a table talking to someone, which is less formulaic than my sort of normal first interview with people is.
Great stuff. And I listen, Rob's talked about this a lot. At the end of the day, I think that's what this medium is about, is people listening into a conversation, right? And I think that's when it's done best.
Yeah, and if you have that chemistry, I mean, if you can develop chemistry with 2 or 3 people in your show, you've got, a pretty wide spectrum of what you can do with that show with your audience too. I mean, this whole thing of a new guest every week can be a little fatiguing to an audience, where if there's some level of consistency there, and that's what I'm looking at doing with my next podcast, is I want to have like 2 to 3 like correspondences to my show that come into the show on a regular basis, but not necessarily as guests, but as contributors, right? So that's the piece that I'm trying to work with right now in my head.
Would they co-host, or would they literally just be there for 10 minutes?
Co-host, but they could have their own solo segment too. So you could have like a lead in with them, together, and then they take like 2 or 3 minutes to talk about a particular area of the show that you want them to cover, and then after they've shared that, then you both dialogue about it. So that was the format that I used to do with my radio show. So I had like guest experts that would come in and talk about, like wireless, back in the early days of the internet, with the technologies that were developing around wireless. I would bring in a wireless expert that would come in onto the show like maybe once a month, and he would give us an update on what's happening with the wireless industry. So that type of a concept is what I was doing.
It's interesting because I don't know if some of my guests, as I said, that I have had report, would be interested in doing something similar to sort of coming in or even co-hosting an episode with me. Yeah, you've really reversed my thought process on, because where you said like the late show people, they are comedians, they're stand-up comedians, but by craft, aren't they?
Right.
The interviewing bit, yes, they need to be able to ask a few questions, but it's really them that is the sparkle.
Yeah, absolutely. It's them. It's their platform. Yeah.
It's all storytelling too. I mean,
Yeah, of course.
those late night shows, that's what they want those guests to do, is come out and tell a funny story. So, yeah.
But then, too, what you're talking about, Rob, what's he retired, and what's his name took his Corbett?
Stephen Colbert?
Yeah, he was one of those guest correspondents on what's his name?
The Daily Show.
On
Jon
The
Stewart.
Daily Show, yeah.
The Daily Show,
Stewart
right.
Show, yeah. So that followed that format to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it did.
But then you come to, when this guy's going to be on, it's probably going to be about this,
Yeah.
I want to make sure before we run out of time, one of the things that resonated with me the most from Nikki was his point about to look at it from the perspective of, I am one of you, but I see things you don't see. I love that.
Yeah.
Go back into that a little bit more detail.
So his perspective, which I agree with, and I've heard said different ways, that the audience, and Rob has spoken to this a lot on this.
Flip it.
Yeah, well, it's about this whole thing that, and if you do, I've been a little bit of a student of good interviewers, which the truth is that there aren't that many out there. But I remember a good interviewer, I can't remember the guy's name, was asked their approach, and Rob has spoken to this as well, that you want to minimize trying to make it sound like it's me talking to the masses out there. We're having a conversation and you're part of it. So the more that I can make it seem like I'm also learning, as opposed to, well, I know this, but if you'll educate my stupid audience on what you mean by blah, 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 that condescension doesn't work, right? And we got to be careful with that. I know I have to be careful with that, not to do that without even thinking about it. So Ethan, you and I, we're on this same, we're trying to be better at being business owners, or we're trying to get through learning how to be better small business owners. I happen to have some experiences, and I'm asking the questions here, so I might see something you don't see, right. But that doesn't mean I'm any better or worse than you. We're peers having a conversation. That's what I took from it.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. And there's a lot of great parts of that. One is it helps take some pressure off that you don't have, because I feel like sometimes when you're hosting something, or you're giving a talk or whatever, there's this kind of like, because I'm here, that means I have to prove that I'm good enough to be here. And then you're sort of
or imposter syndrome can set in, like I've told you I've struggled with when I go to do a topic episode. Is who am I? Well, I'm a business owner, and I have my point of view and experiences to share.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah, so there's that piece, and then just keeping that in mind from the audience. So taking pressure off yourself, but then from the audience perspective, no audience likes that really, right? When there's somebody up there trying to prove, oh, and by the way, I graduated from Stanford with the 4.0 GPA, like, okay, so why is he saying that? Why does he have to prove to us that he's so smart?
Right, that he's or she is the smartest person in the room. It's like, I get
the audience wants you to identify at their level, but just say, here's my perspective. It's probably
it's an interesting point, that, because if you as the host should be bringing something to the conversation.
Absolutely.
but you don't want to patronize either your guest or your audience. But if you can bring in a unique or different view or approach to something, that's when I think you're sort of hitting gold there, because
Yeah, I think so. I think I think you're spot on, Mark. I think that's what he was trying to help us see there, is that, yeah, because I think it's the basics of communication. Mark, I'm going to turn you off if I try to prove to you that I'm the smarter. We've all encountered those people where I have to prove to you how smart I am, and you're like, whatever, I'm moving on to the next person. But if we can relate, if you can relate to me, then I'm more likely to share with you something I might know that you may not have experienced yet.
Yeah, you don't want guests and you being in the pissing contest, do you?
That's true. Yeah, you're right. The dynamic between the guest and host, but I'm talking about also how I treat my listener.
Yeah.
And do I talk down to my listener, or am I one of you, but I see things you don't see? Not because I'm any smarter, but because maybe I have different experiences than you've had.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. And this is something I think about a lot, and it comes into my coaching practice as well. It's just a human thing. We're all,
agreed.
We all have something special to share, but the secret is finding out what is unique about you and then amplifying that. That's really what it is. Not trying to be something else, but you got to find out what is your unique thing, and then just try to nourish it and expose it and let it grow and offer that to other people.
Yeah, and I think related to that, what I say to people as it relates to my coaching, and I think applies to us as podcasters, is what I try to get better and better at is asking good questions. And it's not that I'm any smarter or less smart. It's just that I've honed this craft, this skill of asking a good question, and that hopefully brings out information that we can all learn from.
The smartest person in the room is the person who asks the most questions and is sometimes the quietest as well.
That's exactly right. That's been my experience.
Well, that's the key. You can't get the best answer if you haven't asked the right question or the best question. So,
yeah.
The other thing that I was thinking about, this sort of amplifying the uniqueness, and oh gosh, what was it? I can't remember. But anyways, I think that oh, this is what it was. Your presence. This came up in, actually I went to this, I think I told you about it, Henry. A couple weekends ago on Sunday, I did this breathwork event, and it was a breathwork event with Zoom, and there's probably like 15-20 people, but basically we were all just kind of like laying down and doing this special breathing technique for like 45 minutes. When you're done, you get in this like really interesting state. But at the end of it, the guy who hosted it, he said, "Thank you all for being here. Your presence is so essential to this whole experience," and I think that's also kind of part of this theme of why are you important to the podcast? How do you prove that it's, that you're the best, that your presence there in that seat next to that person, that is what you're bringing to the thing. And I thought about it in that moment. I was like, yeah, this would not have been the same experience for me had there not been the number of people that were there, and those particular people. And some people shared comments, and people shared about their experience. And even if somebody got up at the end of it and said, "I didn't really feel it. I didn't really I just tried my best," that's part of the experience, So that's an interesting amplification of that, being a podcast host and going through your journey. Your presence is a lot of what you're bringing to the table.
I agree. We're at the top of the hour.
Yeah. Cool.
Good conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Good. We went in and dug out some deep stuff. Any last words? Any last things you wanted to mention, Mark? Or
no, not really. It's been great. It's been really interesting tonight. I've got a lot of notes and a lot of not quite rethinking, but just sort of challenging my approach to things. So thank you, guys. It's been great.
Thank you very much.
That's fun.
All right, cool. I think us three are going to stay on here to have a quick chat. So you could sign off whenever you're ready, Mark. I'll get us
Okay.
off the internet, but we'll see you next week.
Thanks a lot.
And
See you next
I'm
week.
going to be
All right,
trying
Mark.
to get, I don't know if
Thanks.
it'll be next week, but I'm going to be trying to get a LinkedIn. Oh, he's gone. I'm going to try to get a LinkedIn expert in too. I think that'd
Okay.
be
No, that'd
interesting.
be awesome. Yeah, I think that the LinkedIn platform is certainly